The festival grounds covered 8 city blocks in downtown Miami. Bayfront Park would host 175,000 attendees over 3 days for one of the largest electronic dance music events in the world. 8 stages, more than 200 performing artists, sound systems powerful enough to be heard miles away. The event had been planned for 18 months, coordinated with city officials, security contractors, emergency medical services, and law enforcement agencies. But a criminal organization was planning to exploit the festival as a distribution venue for contaminated MDMA. 83,000 tablets had been pressed over the previous 2 weeks at a clandestine lab in Fort Lauderdale. The tablets were designed to resemble legitimate MDMA, stamped with logos appealing to electronic music culture. But toxicology analysis would later reveal that each tablet contained MDMA mixed with fentanyl at concentrations that made overdose highly probable. The distribution network consisted of 37 individuals who had obtained vendor credentials, security badges, and guest passes through fraudulent means or bribery. They would enter the festival grounds Friday morning during setup operations, concealing drugs in equipment cases, food service supplies, and personal belongings. Once inside, they would position themselves throughout the venue, ready to sell drugs to attendees as crowds arrived Friday afternoon. The timing was calculated for maximum exposure. Friday evening would see the largest single-day attendance, with 72,000 people expected. Peak crowd density would occur between 9 p.m. and midnight when headlining acts performed on main stages. Users who consumed MDMA during that window would be surrounded by massive crowds, making medical response difficult and delayed. DEA agents had been investigating the operation for 16 weeks. The case began when an informant provided information about a pill press operation in Fort Lauderdale. The informant described industrial-scale production targeting the upcoming festival. Initial surveillance confirmed manufacturing activity at a warehouse facility disguised as an automotive repair shop. Chemical suppliers were traced through financial records. Precursor chemicals required for MDMA synthesis had been purchased in quantities that exceeded any legitimate use. The orders came from shell companies with no verifiable business operations. Purchase patterns suggested clandestine drug manufacturing. Phone intercepts revealed conversations about festival logistics, credential acquisition, and distribution coordination. Operatives discussed which stages would have highest foot traffic, which security checkpoints were most porous, and which times of day would allow maximum sales volume. The planning was detailed and sophisticated. The fentanyl contamination was discovered through analysis of tablets seized in a related investigation 2 weeks earlier. Laboratory testing showed MDMA pressed with fentanyl at ratios that made no pharmacological sense. The combination did not enhance the MDMA experience. It simply added lethal opioid to stimulant, creating unpredictable and dangerous effects. Toxicologists explained that users expecting stimulant effects from MDMA would instead experience combined stimulant and opioid effects. The physiological impact would be contradictory and dangerous. Heart rate would accelerate from MDMA, while respiratory function would depress from fentanyl. The combination could cause cardiac events, respiratory failure, or both simultaneously. The human cost was already visible. 3 people had died from consuming tablets from this production operation during test marketing at smaller events in South Florida. A 21-year-old woman collapsed at a club in Miami Beach. Paramedics found her in cardiac arrest with body temperature exceeding 106 degrees. They administered naloxone for suspected opioid overdose, but her heart had already stopped. Resuscitation efforts failed. A 26-year-old man overdosed at a house party in Fort Lauderdale. Friends reported he had taken what he believed was MDMA. Within 30 minutes, he became disoriented and his breathing slowed dramatically. They called 911 immediately. Paramedics arrived and gave naloxone, which temporarily improved his breathing. But his heart rate was dangerously elevated and his body temperature was rising. He was transported to a hospital where he remained in intensive care for 8 days before recovering. Doctors told him he was extraordinarily lucky to survive. A 19-year-old student died at a beach gathering in Boca Raton. She attended with friends to celebrate spring break. Someone offered tablets described as pure MDMA. She took one. 45 minutes later, she collapsed. Friends performed CPR while waiting for paramedics. Despite aggressive medical intervention, she could not be saved. Toxicology revealed the tablet contained both MDMA and fentanyl. Her parents arrived from Ohio to identify her body and arrange for transport home. These 3 deaths occurred from tablets distributed at small events with hundreds of attendees. The festival would draw 175,000 people over 3 days. If 83,000 contaminated tablets reached that population, the casualty rate would be catastrophic. DEA analysts modeled the projected impact. Based on typical consumption patterns at electronic music festivals and observed effects of fentanyl-contaminated MDMA, the tablets would likely cause between 900 and 1,300 overdoses during the 3-day event. Of those overdoses, approximately 150 to 200 would be fatal despite immediate medical intervention. The numbers were based on conservative assumptions. They assumed that only half the tablets would be consumed during the festival. They assumed that medical response would be rapid and effective. They assumed naloxone would be widely available and properly administered. Even with optimistic assumptions, the death toll would exceed 150 people. Emergency medical infrastructure at the festival was designed for typical incidents. Medical tents staffed by paramedics and nurses, ambulances stationed at multiple access points, protocols for heat-related illness, dehydration, minor injuries, and occasional drug-related emergencies. The system could handle baseline demand plus moderate surge. It could not handle 150 deaths and over 1,000 critical overdoses within 72 hours. Miami-Dade Emergency Medical Services had coordinated with festival organizers to provide enhanced coverage, additional ambulances, extra paramedics, increased naloxone supplies, coordination with area hospitals. But the enhanced preparation was designed for elevated baseline, not for mass casualties from poison drugs being distributed throughout the venue. The festival would begin Friday at 4 p.m. with gates opening to general admission. VIP access would start at 3 p.m. But setup crews, vendors, and security personnel would be on site starting Friday morning at 7 a.m. The distribution network planned to enter during that morning window before full security screening was implemented. Operatives had been assigned specific entry points and cover stories. Some posed as equipment technicians for sound companies. Others presented as food service workers. Several had obtained legitimate credentials by bribing event staff. The methods varied, but the goal was identical. Get inside the perimeter before the festival opened, position drugs for distribution, and wait for crowds to arrive. DEA tactical planning focused on preventing the distributors from entering the festival grounds. Once inside the massive venue with 175,000 people, identifying and interdicting 37 individuals would be nearly impossible. The operation needed to stop the distribution network before they reached the festival perimeter. Intelligence analysis identified the staging location where operatives would gather before moving to the festival. A hotel near the airport was serving as a coordination hub. Surveillance teams documented vehicles arriving Thursday evening and into Friday morning. The operatives were assembling as planned, preparing to transport drugs to the festival. Federal prosecutors finalized warrants for the hotel location, vehicles, the Fort Lauderdale pill press facility, and associated residences. The legal documentation detailed 16 weeks of investigation, including surveillance observations, phone intercepts, financial analysis, and toxicology reports from the 3 deaths. Warrants were approved by federal judges Thursday evening. Tactical teams from DEA, FBI, Miami-Dade Police, and Florida Department of Law Enforcement coordinated execution plans. The hotel raid would require securing multiple rooms simultaneously to prevent operatives from destroying evidence or escaping. The Fort Lauderdale facility needed to be raided in coordination to seize manufacturing equipment and any remaining pills. Timing was critical. All raids needed to execute before operatives departed for the festival. Friday morning at 5:47 a.m., 12 hours before festival gates would open, DEA tactical teams moved. The hotel raid executed first. Agents secured the building perimeter and obtained key access from hotel management. Teams approached assigned rooms simultaneously and announced law enforcement presence. Operatives inside the rooms were caught during final preparations. Drugs were packaged and ready for transport. Credentials were laid out for assignment. Communication equipment was active. The operation was minutes from deployment when agents breached doors and detained personnel. 33 individuals were arrested at the hotel. 4 others were detained in the parking lot attempting to load vehicles. Total arrests at the hotel: 37 individuals, the entire distribution network identified through 16 weeks of investigation. Evidence seized included 83,000 MDMA tablets stamped with various logos, fraudulent festival credentials, cash totaling $214,000, and communication devices containing coordination messages. Simultaneously, the Fort Lauderdale facility was raided. Agents secured the location and found a complete pill press operation. Industrial-grade pressing equipment capable of producing 20,000 tablets per day. Precursor chemicals for MDMA synthesis. Fentanyl powder stored in a separate secure area. Binding agents, dyes, and stamping molds for creating branded tablets. Financial records documenting 6 months of production operations. Additional evidence at the facility revealed this was not the first festival targeted. Records showed prior distribution operations at smaller events throughout South Florida over the previous 6 months. The 3 deaths that occurred during test marketing were mentioned in internal communications. Operatives discussed them as unfortunate but acceptable losses given the profit potential. The total seizure was significant: 83,000 tablets at the hotel. An additional 19,000 tablets in various stages of production at the Fort Lauderdale facility. 102,000 contaminated MDMA tablets removed from circulation 12 hours before they would have entered a festival venue with 175,000 attendees. Festival organizers were briefed immediately. Security protocols were enhanced based on intelligence that some credentials obtained by the network might still be in circulation. Additional screening was implemented for vendor and staff entry points. Law enforcement presence was increased throughout the venue. Medical teams were placed on alert for possible fentanyl-contaminated MDMA, though the primary distribution network had been dismantled. The festival proceeded as scheduled. Friday afternoon, gates opened at 4 p.m. 72,000 people entered Bayfront Park, unaware that they had been 12 hours away from a mass casualty event. Music played. Crowds gathered at stages. The event that was supposed to be a celebration continued without the tragedy that had been planned. Emergency medical services at the festival treated typical incidents: heat exhaustion, dehydration, minor injuries. A few drug-related cases involving substances that were not part of the interdicted operation. Medical tents maintained normal operations. Ambulances remained on standby. The surge that would have overwhelmed them never materialized. Over the 3-day event, Festival Medical Services treated 4 MDMA-related cases serious enough to require hospital transport. All 4 patients survived. Toxicology showed the MDMA they consumed was not from the interdicted batch. The cases were typical for an event of this size. The 900 to 1,300 overdoses that were projected never occurred. The 150 to 200 deaths that were prevented left no evidence except in the analysis of what would have happened. Public health officials who had prepared for potential crisis stood down. Hospital emergency departments maintained normal weekend operations. The mass casualty protocols that had been activated remained unused. Miami-Dade Medical Examiner's Office did not receive 150 bodies that would have required processing, identification, and family notification. DEA analysts reviewed the outcome. 83,000 contaminated tablets would have been distributed throughout the festival venue. Based on typical consumption patterns, approximately 40,000 people would have taken at least 1 tablet during the 3-day event. Of those 40,000 exposures, between 900 and 1,300 would have required emergency medical intervention. 150 to 200 would have been fatal. The math was brutal but clear. Each tablet increased the probability of overdose. Each overdose created risk of death. 40,000 people taking contaminated MDMA meant 40,000 opportunities for tragedy. The festival would have become a crime scene. Multiple death investigations would have occurred simultaneously. The event would have been shut down. Chaos would have overwhelmed emergency response capacity. Families who traveled to Miami expecting their children to return home would have instead received death notifications. Young adults who attended the festival to hear music and celebrate with friends would have died from consuming drugs they believed were safe. The victims would have been concentrated in the 18 to 28 age demographic, people at the beginning of their adult lives. The parents of the 19-year-old who died in Boca Raton described the experience of receiving notification. A police officer arrived at their home in Ohio at 2 a.m. The officer explained their daughter had overdosed at a beach gathering in Florida. They would need to travel to Miami to identify her body. The funeral was held 2 weeks later. Their daughter's college friends attended and shared stories about her plans and dreams. None of it changed the reality that she was gone because she consumed a drug she thought was something it was not. If the festival distribution had succeeded, that experience would have been repeated 150 to 200 times. 150 to 200 families receiving notifications. 150 to 200 bodies requiring identification. 150 to 200 funerals. The grief would have rippled through communities across the United States and internationally as festival attendees came from throughout the world. The absence of tragedy is invisible. The 40,000 people who would have consumed contaminated MDMA attended the festival safely. They heard their favorite artists perform. They danced with friends. They created memories. They went home. They continued their lives. None of them knew they had been 12 hours away from potential death. The emergency medical personnel who prepared for mass casualties maintained normal operations. The hospital beds that would have been filled with overdose patients remained available for other patients. The medical staff who would have been overwhelmed with critical cases managed typical festival-related incidents. The system that would have collapsed under impossible demand functioned normally. But the threat was real. The pills were real. The distribution network was real. The timing was precise. Friday morning at 5:47 a.m., agents raided the hotel where operatives were preparing to transport 83,000 contaminated tablets to the festival. 12 hours later, those operatives would have been inside the venue, positioned throughout 8 city blocks, selling drugs to thousands of people. The first overdoses would have occurred Friday evening. Users who consumed tablets early in the night would have felt effects within 30 to 60 minutes. The combination of MDMA and fentanyl would have caused unpredictable reactions. Some would experience accelerated heart rates and hyperthermia from MDMA while simultaneously experiencing respiratory depression from fentanyl. The contradictory effects would stress cardiovascular and respiratory systems in ways that created immediate life-threatening conditions. Festival medical tents would have been overwhelmed within hours. Dozens of people collapsing simultaneously. Paramedics attempting to triage and treat while more patients continued arriving. Naloxone would reverse opioid effects, but would not address the MDMA toxicity. Cooling measures would treat hyperthermia, but would not address respiratory depression. Medical staff would have been forced to make desperate decisions about which patients received transport to hospitals and which patients received on-site care. Miami area hospitals would have received patients faster than they could process them. Emergency departments designed to handle 5 to 10 critical patients at a time would have received 50 to 75 patients over several hours. Intensive care units would have filled completely. Ventilators would have been allocated based on triage criteria. Some patients would have died waiting for care that arrived too late. By Saturday morning, the scale of the crisis would have been apparent. Festival organizers would have shut down the event. Law enforcement would have launched investigations. Media coverage would have been international. The tragedy would have dominated news cycles for weeks. Miami would have been associated with the festival catastrophe for years. None of that happened. The raid occurred 12 hours before distribution would have begun. The operatives were arrested before entering the festival grounds. The tablets were seized before reaching attendees. The crisis was prevented at the exact moment when intervention was still possible, but delay would have made it impossible. The margin was 12 hours. Friday morning at 5:47 a.m. versus Friday evening at 6 p.m. when distribution would have accelerated. That window was the difference between a successful festival and a mass casualty event. 83,000 contaminated tablets, 40,000 potential exposures, 900 to 1,300 overdoses, 150 to 200 deaths, all prevented because agents executed raids 12 hours before operatives would have entered the venue. The investigation revealed sophisticated planning. The distribution network had researched festival layout, security procedures, crowd flow patterns, and optimal distribution locations. They had obtained legitimate credentials through multiple methods. They had tested their product at smaller events and knew it was lethal, but proceeded anyway because profit potential outweighed moral concerns. The manufacturing facility in Fort Lauderdale had been operating for at least 6 months, producing contaminated MDMA for various events throughout South Florida. The 3 deaths that occurred during test marketing were documented in internal communications. Operatives acknowledged the deaths, but characterized them as acceptable risk in pursuit of revenue. The callousness was documented in messages that would later be used as evidence in federal prosecutions. But 16 weeks of investigation exposed the operation. Human intelligence from an informant started the case. Surveillance documented manufacturing activity. Financial analysis traced precursor chemical purchases. Phone intercepts revealed distribution planning. Laboratory analysis identified fentanyl contamination. Every piece of evidence contributed to comprehensive understanding of the network. When the decision was made to execute raids, timing was precise. Friday morning, 12 hours before festival gates opened, before operatives departed the hotel staging location, before drugs entered the festival perimeter, before any attendee had opportunity to consume contaminated tablets, the window between preparation and distribution. The work continues. Other criminal organizations are targeting festivals. Different manufacturing operations are producing contaminated drugs. New distribution networks are being established. The threat persists. Music festivals remain vulnerable venues where young people gather in large numbers, creating opportunities for drug sales that criminal enterprises exploit. But this operation, this network, these 83,000 tablets, these 40,000 potential exposures, these 900 projected overdoses, these 150 projected deaths were stopped. Friday morning, 12 hours before the festival began. The timing made the difference. The investigation was thorough. The coordination was comprehensive. The outcome was definitive. 175,000 people attended the festival over 3 days. They heard music, celebrated with friends, and went home safely. They did not know that 12 hours before gates opened, federal agents raided a hotel and seized 83,000 contaminated MDMA tablets intended for distribution throughout the venue. They did not know they had been hours away from a mass casualty event. The absence of tragedy is invisible, but the evidence of what was prevented remains in the case files, the toxicology reports, and the knowledge that timing made the difference between festival celebration and catastrophe.